Now, who do you think I'm describing? The world started paying attention to them in 2002-03 as they stepped up their campaign in favour of an invasion of Iraq. In the following years, their trajectory was generally seen as a short-lived aberration, a rapid rise and fall, ending up in the failure that was the Iraq intervention, discrediting once and for all their idealistic militarism. Well, first, the answer to my question is neoconservatives. And secondly, my next guest says that while that quote represents the conventional view of neocons, it's inaccurate. Dr. Justin Vase is Senior Fellow and Director of Research at the Centre on United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. He is a Frenchman working in the UK and in Washington, and his thesis on neocons, their history, their influence and why they still do very much matter, will be expanded in his upcoming book Neoconservatism, the biography of a movement. And he's been addressing Australian groups earlier this month. A short time ago, Justin Vase took our phone call and I welcomed him to Saturday Extra.
Thanks very much, Geraldine.
Justin Vase, before we get to why neoconservatism still matters, and indeed could matter even more in the future, who were people referring to when that label was first used almost 40 years ago?
Well, neoconservatism is a very complex movement that underwent several transformations. Avatar is probably the movie of the year, so I guess we could use the image of different avatars, but I prefer to use the metaphor of three families. You had the original family of neoconservatives, the one to whom the label was applied in the first place. These were New York intellectuals, mostly interested in domestic issues, and they were liberals, but they were reacting against what they saw as a dangerous leftward turn in liberalism in the 60s, things like the student protest, black nationalism, radical feminism or environmentalism, and more importantly, they were reacting against what they saw as the excesses of social engineering, if you'd like, of Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, the war on poverty, etc. So they were still liberals, but they started to be critical of the excesses of liberalism. And in order to sort of banish them from liberalism, their enemies on the left tagged them with the label neoconservatives so as to sort of point out that they were actually conservatives in disguise. So this was the first family.
But they weren't particularly interested in foreign policy, were they?
No, that's the irony. This group, people like Irving Kristol, Pat Moynihan, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, and many others, they were really social scientists and really interested in domestic issues, not foreign policy issues.
So how did they sort of cross the party line and start, because some of them went to work eventually for the Reagan administration?
Well, this is where complexity kicks in. Then you have to refer to a second family of neoconservatives who were also called the Scoop Jackson Democrats. They were Democrats who were followers of Senator Scoop Jackson from the state of Washington and who reacted a few years after the original neoconservatives, who reacted also against the New Left, but also reacted against Nixon and Kissinger's policy of détente, that is, of accommodation with the USSR. And since they had pretty much the same enemies, the label became applied to them as well, because both the original neoconservatives, the first family, and the second family, the Scoop Jackson Democrats, had as enemies the New Left. And so it was this second family that went to work for Reagan and was really interested in foreign policy. They were advocating a policy of assertiveness, of muscular anti-communism. They were advocating a policy of defending fellow democracies, starting with Israel.
And never doing deals with people whom they regarded as authoritarian or beneath them.
Exactly. Never accommodating regimes, but rather trying to change these regimes. And so people like Jeane Kirkpatrick, who became ambassador for Ronald Reagan at the UN, or Richard Pearl, or Elliot Abrams, and many others. So this second family really were the one who crossed the party line and inspired a large part of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy.
Let's jump forward to the mid-90s then, and the Cold War is over and the United States has triumphed, and we go into this unipolar moment, as it's been described. Tell us about the third group of neocons that somewhat surprisingly emerged.
Yes, it's surprising because the neoconservatives, the second family, had really been linked to the Cold War. They really were linked with the Cold War, and so you would have expected that they would have disappeared when the Berlin Wall fell, right? But then surprisingly, and as many people were writing obituaries for the neoconservative movement, a third family emerged starting in 1995 around reviews like the Weekly Standard by Bill Kristol, who is Irving Kristol's son, and some of the older generation with people I mentioned already, like Richard Pearl or Elliot Abrams or Paul Wolfowitz and others. And this third family, which we generally name as, the Neocons, were a bit different from the first two families. First, they are firmly on the right, and second, of course, they think and write and give prescriptions in a world that is very different from that of the Cold War, a world in which America's relative power is much more enhanced and much more important than what it used to be under the Cold War. And of course, what they are best known for their advocacy of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but of course their history is not only about the Iraq War.
Justin Vase is my guest on Saturday Extra, a senior fellow and director of research at the Brookings Institution and the Centre on the United States and Europe. As you point out in your very good piece, that they're not a popular movement, they've never been an electoral force, they don't have any regional, religious or economic base, but there are 5 pillars that sort of represent them: internationalism, primacy, unilateralism, militarism and democracy. Now let's focus on primacy, because it's inextricably linked to this sense of American exceptionalism, isn't it? That they're the indispensable nation. How exactly does that help them come to conclusions about where American foreign policy ought to be?
Well, every school of thought in American foreign policy has an underlying representation of the world. So for the neocons, the underlying vision of the world is one where peace and stability are provided by America's dominance and the situation of unipolarity. It's something that is known as the theory of stable hegemony. What it means concretely is that the U.S., basically it's a blessing, as seen by the neocons, it's a blessing that in the current situation you would have only one superpower, and that superpower would be democratic and would not be aggressive against other countries. And so the aim of the neocons is to maintain that primacy because they see it as the best chance for world order and maintenance of peace.
It's an amazing quinella, isn't it? Believing you're uniquely remarkable, as America does, and benign as well.
Yeah, because of course there is a sort of inner contradiction, or at least a tension between, on the one hand, the idea that the best way to maintain peace is to maintain your own predominance on the international system, and then on the second hand, the more destabilizing vision, which is also part of the neocon vision, which is that you should promote democracy and you should ensure peace. And of course, the fact of throwing your weight around, of doing military interventions, etc., necessarily leads to some backlash and some reaction, which destabilize the system. So that there is sort of a tension here between stability on the one hand and the necessity of keeping that primacy on the other hand, and that is one of the issues that neocons have to deal with.
Finally, Justin, I wonder how allies, like Australia, ought to regard them. You say they demand total obedience, really, from allies. Australia's in a very delicate position now because it's so economically dependent upon China. How would you advise an Australian team trying to marshal its foreign policy credentials in terms of dealing with these people?
Well, currently, fortunately, you don't have to actually deal with the neocons because, of course, they're not in power, and even though they're influential in the intellectual debate, they don't have the type of political influence that they had under Reagan, for example, or of course under the first administration, at least, of George W. Bush. But still, the question remains, and of course there is a sort of tension here again in the neoconservative vision between, on the one hand, defending democracies and pointing out how important is it to have an alliance of democracies, a league of democracies, etc. And on the other hand, insisting that other countries follow U.S. leadership. And this was evident in the case of Iraq, when my own country, France, and others like Germany or Mexico or Turkey, all of them democracies, were harshly bashed and criticized by the neocons in their campaign in favor of the war. And so applied to Australia, of course, if the neoconservatives come back, and they tend to have a pretty muscular vision, I would say, an antagonistic vision of China, of course, the difficulty will be walking that fine line between still being a good ally of the US on the one hand, and on the other hand, probably resisting what will be a constant pressure for being tougher vis-à-vis China.
Justin Vase, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Saturday Extra. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for the invitation.
And Justin is Senior Fellow and Director of Research at the Centre on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and he wrote a very interesting paper recently for the Lowy Institute called Why Neoconservatism Still Matters. And if you go to the Lowy Institute, www.loweyinstitute.org, I think you'll find that there and find it very useful.